Okay, yay, finally. We are on our Gothic chapter. This is the last chapter that we will be covering in Western art. Yay, right? Okay. Um, let's get started. Yeah. So, in this chapter, we focus on Gothic art, more accurately, changes in architecture, some in sculpture, and we begin to see lots of stained glass. So, stained glass is kind of the way I like to think of it is an evolution from our mosaics that we saw a couple chapters back. But with the addition of stained glass windows in cathedral, a person that is within the cathedral gets this kind of new sense of like this heavenly area. The atmosphere just feels so much more divine, and I mean, just being within one of these cathedrals just transports you to a different place. So these stained glass windows are very symbolic for the Gothic period, but I'm jumping way ahead, so let me rein it back in. Yeah, we're going to talk about architecture, some sculpture, and stained glass. We're focusing on the Gothic style in France for this lecture, um, although we see Gothic all over Europe at this time. So, starting with some images, because I'm sure most of you have seen Gothic structures before. So, in architecture, we start to see and notice a strong vertical pull or vertical emphasis on churches. So, looking at this image here, we see, our roof spiked, every little, you know, uh, capital like pointing upward. We see things called uh, gables and crockets. So, last presentation, I briefly mentioned them. But gables and crockets are the nice fine details. So typically around a pointed arch, there would be a gable or kind of a decorative rim around it, and then crockets would be spikes on these little vertical domes. So we see an emphasis on vertical. We see lots of pointed arches. That's another thing that is so different. Previously, we've talked about rounded arches, but a good way to identify a Gothic structure is by um, their pointed arches. So if you look here, you see an arch, it comes to a point, and then it goes back down again. So that's a good way of identifying. Um, I did mention gables and crockets. Also, what's new are rose windows. So here's an example of our rose window. So emphasis on windows and on light, and not just bright light, but more colored light, and how to modify the light to increase the spiritual experience of the visitor at the church. So I touched on that a little bit, but we'll talk about that some more later. So our Gothic overview, it's a style that dominated Northern Europe from the middle of the 12th century to the 15th. So we did a huge time jump. It's often referred to as French work, French style, or modern work. Gothic was a derogatory term used by 16th century Italians to describe the style popular among the Goths, or Germanic tribes of the north. Gothic art was popular in cities rather than rural monasteries. So, Gothic often means something beautiful and light filled, beautiful stone work, but in fact, Gothic was very much, um, like I said, a derogatory term used in the 16th century to describe this style in Northern Europe. This idea is that it was more of a barbaric style by barbarians up Northern Europe, which seems kind of silly to us now. I mean, given how elaborate and ornate these cathedrals are. But for the Italians, when they were entering into the Renaissance and the new styles of art were becoming more popular, the Gothic style became very much out of fashion, so it received this more derogatory name. But today, when we say Gothic, we don't necessarily mean something bad. We can mean something beautiful with stained glass and beautiful stonework and things like that. So, in the Romanesque period, we were focused on pilgrimage churches, churches that people would go to that were in different areas to get to, but these Gothic churches tend to be in more urban areas. So, we'll start off with Abbot and his church of Saint Denis, which is just outside of Paris. Saint Denis was the church where the French monarchs were buried. He wanted to increase the prestige of the monastery and also his own abbey, his own prestige, by rebuilding the original basilica that was there, basically to enlarge it. He was definitely at the top in terms of people that he interacted with. He was an advisor to both Louis the Sixth and King Louis the Seventh. So Suze talks about the light that he's introducing into the church in his writings in the book of Suze, but also talked about the sculptural work that he's incorporating, the metal work he's adding. So most books emphasize the stained glass, but in his writings he does talk about the entire change of the church and all of these different elements. So Suze is kind of the architect of Saint Denis. When it came time to revive it and enlarge it, and he wanted to recreate God's house into something brand new. Um, and it's become a burial place for kings of France, which is important to note. Let's look at other slides. So looking at the ambulatory, it's much more open, almost looking like like a spider web in terms of its complex vaulting systems that are going on here. You can see that the structure is being supported um, by structures that almost look like arrows pointing inward. So this is also known as a system of buttressing. Let's see if we can find a better picture. Oh yeah. So like these structures here going up all the way up to the top of the ambulatory and downward. This was kind of a system of buttressing where the support is really put on the outside, but it's on the inside here. Oops. There is also outside buttressing that is additional kind of support. But let me find my way back here. So this type of support allowed for, sorry, I'm jumping around so much. So looking at this image down here, this type of support allowed for much more open and airy rooms, and it allowed for larger windows to be introduced. So we see these windows here, and we see a complex system of masonry vaulting, which we see up here and here. It's kind of unorganized, but you get the gist. So it is a lot different than what we saw in Romanesque. So Romanesque, the pilgrimage churches were more dungeon-like. Here, in comparison, we have light, to say the least. So Romanesque, very heavy dungeon-like, but now we see more confidence in gaining the ability to kind of mess with the engineering to allow light to kind of come in. So by having more of these pointed arches, you get that emphasis on the vertical, everything's going up. They also learned how to put some of the buttressing on the outside of the church, which allows for larger windows and for light to come into the structure. And there's a YouTube video that goes along with this slide, so please check this out. So, a little bit more about Saint Denis. Saint Denis is characterized by new thin columns that rise to the ceiling with pointed arches and ribbed vaults, a sense of weightlessness because of the interior walls. Um, they've been taken away, so it's open, it's airy, it appears to defy gravity. This space is filled with light because of the translucent walls of glass that creates a connection between earth and heaven. Suger felt the light was divine light from above. June of 1144, the church was dedicated to the King of France. Many came to view it, and many were zealous to build their own. So there was kind of like this huge inspiration to go and build their own cathedral. Ceilings would now go higher and higher with each new building as they attempted to outshine each other or outdo each other. So here we have, just to name a few famous cathedrals in Paris, we have Notre Dame, which is at 108 feet tall, Chartres at 121, Reims at 125, Amiens 139, and Bayeux at 158. Very, very tall. So at the start, Gothic was small. So the start being around 1140. Within 100 years, it was throughout Europe, and by 1550, it disappears almost entirely. The theme changed from God the Judge to that of God of Salvation. So a spirit of hope. So we see this change not only in architecture, but we see a change in people's attitudes, to be honest. Romanesque kind of had this dark and dreary kind of Middle Ages vibe where, you know, the end is coming, the end is nigh. But here, I mean, kind of symbolic with the windows in the churches, there's light, people are more optimistic, hopeful, things like that. Not to mention that Crusades are over too, so wars are over and things like that. The term Gothic is used for the architecture and its characteristics. I know it's typical to think of Gothic as a fashion style nowadays or a cultural style, but totally different meaning when it comes to art history. We're talking about architecture and its characteristics. Moving on. Okay, so we have Chartres Cathedral. It's the first fully Gothic cathedral. So remember, life was harsh, and the cathedral gave them hope and a place where they could believe, and they needed hope. Uh, Theirs was a living art, and the entire community took pride in the building, which took close to 100 to 125 years to complete. And it's quite impressive. Notice the plan of it. Look familiar? It's a longitudinal plan with a transept. So, this type of architecture is so very symbolic. We talked about rebus and symbolism, and we see it even in our architecture. We talked about the cross and what the cross meant and symbolized, and here we see the cross even in the blueprint or in the structure. So it's kind of like a full circle moment, if you will, bringing all of that iconography together. And here's our night view. Modern lighting fixtures attached. We have our rose stained glass window. We have our two towers in front of the building. Is pretty classic of Gothic characteristic, by the way, too. Chartres is considered the first fully Gothic because it was planned to have 3-story elevations with large glass windows. Another change was going to a rectangular base system. It allowed for more options and the elimination of bulky support. This created a continuous sweep of space. So we see the outside view again, but each one of these kind of breaks would be considered a story. So here we have the photo cut off, but this would be our first story. And then here, this middle section would be our second story, aka ambulatory. And then up at the top, typically known as the attic or the story that housed windows, is our Claire story. Here we see it from a different angle. So you see each one of these horizontal lines going around. That's kind of like breaking it up into sections, or kind of like registers too, but here it's not really telling any stories. And with this slide, I do have a video that goes along with it, so please check that out. But, just pointing out Gothic characteristics in these images. We have pointed arches, we have stained glass windows, we have more than 2 stories. More than 2 stories instantly rules out any other art movement, and it's Gothic. And then in each bay would be typically 6 ribs to support the ceiling in each bay. Probably the most famous cathedral is Notre Dame. People have been drawn to it ever since it was built. Originally, it was to have 4 elevations, so 4 levels, 4 stories. It began in 1163 and finished about a century later. Sorry. And I won't go into too much detail about this, but check out the YouTube video I have linked to know more. Looking on the outside of it, we have our this is kind of new for Gothic, but for the entrances, you have 3 entrances with pointed arches, and we have our rose stained glass with our 2 towers, and then again, emphasis on the vertical. Here's just more pictures. So this is a side view. The side view does a great job of showing the crockets on the tower here. So the crockets are the little spikes, or in this case, what we see are bumps. These supports, kind of looking like ribs, like a human, like thinking of a human skeleton, you think of ribs. They look very similar, but these are actually flying buttresses, so they add more support. Because of all of these supports, we notice we have windows. So lots of windows. And just lots of ornate detailing that's kind of like the new added sculptural element for, it's like sculpture meets architecture. How about that? Another view, flying buttresses, stained glass. And then we have gables, so these guys over here. Gables were just like decorative triangles above sections. I think these gables were to, this is just my opinion, but I think these gables were added to kind of, since there was so much support, it kind of meant to hide the support. So these were kind of put over them to hide all of the supports being there. So yes, just to kind of break it down for you again, in Gothic architecture, we see flying buttresses, pointed arches, 3-story elevations, 3 plus, to be honest. There could be a 4th too. So, pointed arch, flying buttress, and then here we see crockets and gables. And can't really tell, but there's a 3-story elevation. Another image of a flying buttress, or flying buttresses. And another, here we are sandwiched between two, pointed arches. And another flying buttress, in case you forgot what they looked like from the last slide. Um, so here we are looking at the ceiling, we're looking at the vaulting system. So, to break down, let's get my little pen laser thing green. To break down the ceiling, we have, think of it as, okay, there's a square here, there's a square here, and a square that continues down there. Each one of these squares is known as a bay. And within these bays, we have 6 ribbed vaults. So this is a vault, or this is a rib, 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 and that is a rib. So what these ribs do is that they support the ceiling. And then they would come down to the side wall here, and on the outside of this wall is where our flying buttress is attached. So all of it kind of, the pressure from the top of this bay goes down the ribs and then outside to the flying buttress. And then the flying buttress would be connected to a regular buttress that is kind of at its kind of attached to a buttress that is what's the right word? Attached to the ground as a foundation. So it has nowhere to go. So once it, again, and we have a different image here. This section right here is what is referred to as a bay. Within the bay, we have ribs. And the fact that they are curved means that they are vaulted. Okay? Oh, look, more flying buttresses. So this gives you an outside view. So, like I said, here would be the point, or here, or here, or here, would be the point that had the most pressure. Pressure is relieved by one of, or each of these ribs. The ribs would connect to the wall. Then the wall would be connected to a flying buttress outside, and then this flying buttress connected to a regular buttress or pier. That is the foundation, and it's the most stable. So everything is grounded at this point. Okay? And then this is an image, just because a couple years ago, if you recall, Notre Dame was actually, it caught fire. So it's really sad to see it in this state. But yeah, sad. But it's being rebuilt. So yeah, hopefully we'll see some progress on that. But it's sad to see some of the original architecture, be burned away. Okay, so now we're talking about something known as a triforum. So, triforum is a Gothic term, and it replaces the ambulatory from Romanesque. So, remember when I talked about the first floor, second floor, third floor? Well, now this second floor is no longer called an ambulatory, but it's called a triforum. It's no longer called an ambulatory because there's no room for worship here. Typically, an ambulatory would be like a secondary, like a backup area in case that there were too many people in the nave. So they would go up to the second story and watch the procession from there. But this is just mainly served as a decorative purpose. So no longer for worshiping. It's a much smaller or narrower area maybe even used as a passageway or a hallway, things like that. But, this was no place for people to come to congregate. Um, so no longer ambulatory, triforum. Okay? So the theme of Notre Dame is the Virgin. She is everywhere in most Gothic buildings. They were dedicated to her. So the Virgin being the Virgin Mary. So within these cathedrals, space has really been opened up. So we have windows, and the appearance of heavenly light and divine space um is met within the atmosphere of being inside a cathedral. Okay, moving on to Lyon Cathedral. Many of these cathedrals are named after the city that they're in. Lyon Cathedral is famous for a couple of reasons. Most interesting is that there are oxen sculptures on the bell towers, um, which we see here. Oxen were very symbolic in this region. They helped build the city and would run the cranes by walking in a circle around the wheel that powered the cranes. So the cathedral has three portals, or I'm jumping ahead. So to kind of dedicate or commemorate or appreciate or show appreciation, these oxen were placed up in one of the bell towers. Um, oh, going back. So the cathedral has three portals or three entryways, which I told you from a couple slides ago is pretty characteristic of Gothic. Um, what we see, I'm asking here, what do we see that is Romanesque? So, Romanesque, remember we had tympanums, which were these kind of scenes above the doorways. That is something that is reminiscent of the Romanesque style. And then, even here in the pendentive or the top, we have scenes. So the cathedral has three portals or three entryways, which is common in Gothic cathedrals. We have a rose window in the center, and with two identical towers. Sometimes these would be bell towers, so at the top there would be bells inside, signaling the mass or the hour. Um, uh, we have a very staggering appearance, and this is supposed to be a cathedral that is more cavernous than anything we've seen previously. So it's more cave-like. Our oxen again. Okay. So just to reiterate, Gothic is seen with the following: pointed arches, flying buttresses, ribbed vaulting. Something that is new or renamed is a triforium. And then we have stained glass, which is located in the third floor, maybe the fourth, um, also known as the clerestory. So, breaking down the interior of Lyon, there's more of a narrow nave. The walls are moving in as the roof is moving up. There's a reason to this. Visually, the idea is the narrower you make the nave, the taller it appears. And again, that emphasis on the vertical. We have some of the arches from the rib vaulting coming all the way down to the wall, but every other one has more. That's because it has the crossing arch moving across the ceiling. We have more apparent columns, and they kind of look short and stout here, but they're not. They're pretty tall. Pointed arches, again, common in Gothic. There's a 6-part vault, so it's not really seen here, but believe me, it's there. So basically what we have is a vault where there's an arch running through the center of it. There would be 6 ribs in it in each bay. They're playing around with these idea of what's going to be stronger and what allows for more height. Oh, check that out. So here we actually see, it's interesting, we do see 4 stories. So we have the main story, ambulatory, triforium, and clerestory. Sometimes these would be grouped together though, so don't quote me on this. So this could be just known as a triforium and then clerestory. Oh no, see, I was right. There is a 4-story elevation. This cathedral has an ambulatory and a triforium and a clerestory. Okay, sorry for the confusion. I was right. Yes. Okay, moving on. So, right, we see a four-part elevation. So classically, what we have is an aisle, a gallery, um, ambulatory, triforium, and clerestory. But at Lyon, they include something called a triforium, and this is where the roof would actually come down over the side aisles. So, this is no longer something that could be walked through, and then the windows would come on top. Oh, and then here we have a nice little cutout view. So this does a great job of showing where the triforium is and where the roof comes down. So, pretty basic. Nave, aisle, ambulatory, triforium, clerestory, where the windows are located. And then here we see an example of flying buttresses. Nice. And that's it. We're done for the semester. Yay. What do I have on the next couple of slides? Oh, this is just, okay, we don't need to get into this. This is just in case you need to take test 3. There's kind of a review section. But with that said, now, what needs to be done? So on Thursday, 12 p.m., our final quiz opens up. The quiz is on Romanesque and Gothic, I believe. And depending on whether or not, what grade percentage you're getting in the class, that depends on if you are taking test 3 or not. So if you are maintaining an 80 or above, you do not need to take the test. I will send out a formal, not so formal, but just an email just to say you're clear. You don't need to take this. Have a nice winter break, Christmas, New Year's, and I'll miss you. But if you do have to take the test, then depending whether or not we meet in class or in person or online, then we meet in person, then we will meet Tuesday, regular class time. If we meet online, then you will have Tuesday, whenever you're available, until midnight to take test 3. I will not provide a review day, but I will provide kind of a study guide presentation that will be posted up onto Canvas um, on Friday. Okay? So, with that being said, it was a pleasure to have you in my class. Don't be a stranger, and if you have any questions, please email me. That is about it. Good luck with the quiz!